Once again, the Minnesota Crime Wave is here, presenting murder, mayhem, and some really interesting things, along with a particularly interesting guest. Let me introduce the other members of the Minnesota Crime Wave. Over here on my right is Ellen Hart, who's 1/3 of the distaff side of the Crime Wave. Since there are only 3 of us, there can only be, we have an imbalance. That's just the way it is. And over here on my left is Mr. Kent Kruger.
The non-distaff side.
The non-distaff side. That's the left side. I don't know. That's not a political statement, folks. So just don't read anything into it that isn't there. We have a really interesting program. One of our guests today, in fact, the only guest today, is Garrett Schultz, who's a co-owner of Once Upon a Crime, the premier mystery bookstore in the Twin Cities. And we're going to talk about a number of other things, including what we think are some really important authors. And the way we did, I've set this up a little bit. We said, all right, let's talk about significant authors that we think are important for people to read. I mean, we have opinions about that, like everybody else does, and you don't have to take our opinions, but we're going to explain that to you. But we didn't tell each other who we had chosen. So we just each sat down and made up a roster of 5 authors or 5 books that we think are important for people who are interested in mystery fiction ought to read. And that's how we're going to do this.
The way that I sort of thought of it in my mind was that we could do authors and or books, and as we were talking before the program, we pretty much said even if someone is a fairly famous author, if we know that author, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case for people who might be tuning in who don't know a lot about mysteries or whatever. So you know what? Let's start with Kent, and you go through your 5 books or 5 authors and a little bit about why.
Okay, brief justification.
Yes.
My first 3 authors I've chosen because they're authors who have either produced a seminal work in the genre or have opened the door for others to follow them. My first name is Raymond Chandler.
Sure.
Along with Dashiell Hammett and probably James M. Cain and Jim Thompson, a guy who really developed the tough American noir form of the mystery. And while I appreciate the writing of those other guys I mentioned, I think Raymond Chandler is far and away the very best because he's not only tells a good tough story, his prose is just phenomenal to read. So Raymond Chandler tops my list. Second is a woman named Marcia Muller, who writes the Sharon McCone series. And I put Marcia on because she, along with Sue Grafton and Sarah Paretsky, really opened the door for women to write tough PI
Good
novels.
Choice.
Yeah. And I chose her not only for that reason, but she writes a series. Her series is set in California, very often, most generally in the San Francisco area. And I love the way she uses the locale as a part of her stories. And speaking of locale, the 3rd author on my list is Tony Hillerman. I couldn't leave out Hillerman because Hillerman is a lot of the reason I do what I do. Hillerman writes the Jim Chee and Joe Leaphorn series set in the Four Corners area of the Southwest, deals significantly with the Navajo culture. And the primary reason I chose Hillerman is the fact that he writes about the Navajo culture and opened that door to so many of us who write not only about the Indian cultures, but so many of the minority cultures in our nation. 4th on my list is James Lee Burke, one of my all-time favorite authors. Burke I put on here because he has a profound sense of place at the heart of his novels. And he's so beautiful when it comes to his prose. When I read a James Lee Burke novel, I can smell the fetid swamp. I can taste the dirty rice.
Absolutely.
I can hear the Cajuns talk, and I'm right there with him. And he writes a dark novel, and he has to write it so beautifully to seduce a reader into that dark story, I think. And the fifth guy on my list is he's a new guy. I decided I would bring a new name to the table, Craig Johnson. Craig Johnson writes the Walt Longmire series, which is set in Wyoming. And I chose Craig because he's new on the scene, because he's very good, because he, like all of the writers I enjoy and and I try to do this myself, writes profoundly out of a sense of place. His Wyoming landscape
Burke
is
did.
exactly. Wyoming landscape is really powerful. He also writes a very literate, and I'm not sure if that's a term I should throw around here because we all have responses to that. He writes a very literate mystery. So those are my 5.
And Carl.
Okay. Well, I'm two of the people that Kent mentioned, James Lee Burke and Marcia Muller, are also on my list for many of the same reasons. One of my favorite authors is James Sallis. He's a poet. He wrote a very strange series about he's not black, but he wrote a very strange series about a black detective named Lou Griffin. One of his most recent books is a very short, almost a novella called Drive. He writes a very fast, driven. You start the book and it never lets up. It just punches right on through. A lot of people don't like him because he doesn't have a lot of depth in many of his stories, but he writes it in a very poetical manner. I like John D. MacDonald because John D. MacDonald, particularly Travis McGee, but MacDonald gets a bad rap because most people only think of McGee as his books.
Yeah.
John D. MacDonald, in fact, wrote over 50 mystery novels, and only a small number were written specifically for this publisher, the Travis McGee. But that kind of freebooter had not really been seen before, and so I think that was important. I like historical mystery novels. That's why I put Ross MacDonald on the list. The Lou Archer series, I think, is really interesting because he uses historical events to inform current activities, current murders and things like that. Walter Mosley, because he writes a really interesting The Easy Rollins series.
Mosley was almost on my list too. Yeah.
And finally, one of the best satirists in the mystery field ever going, unfortunately he's dead now, his name is Richard Prather. He's really a gifted satirical crime fiction writer. I could spend the next half hour telling you wonderful stories about the stuff he wrote, but I won't.
Okay. I have chosen 5, and one of the reasons that I chose some of the books that I did was because I knew you guys would choose primarily men, and you did. You didn't disappoint me.
Were we predictable or what?
So I have chosen primarily women.
Good.
First is The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which you all know I have had a spotted history with. I've tried to put this book through a number of book groups, and an awful lot of people haven't liked it. But it's one of my absolute favorites. I think she's a phenomenal writer, very gothic writer. It's one of the books that I think has the best characterizations and some of the most beautiful language.
I'll tell you because it's in my TBR.
Okay. It's
list,
wonderful. Next one would be, I'm just putting in a plug for true crime, because I know not an awful lot of people read true crime, but I do, and I love it. And Anne Rule, to me, she
writer.
rules true crime. And I'm just going to mention one of her books, Dead by Sunset. That was probably one of my absolute favorites. She was a personal friend of Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and so wrote...
Before or after?
Before.
Really?
She knew
This
him.
is a recommendation?
Yes. Well, no, she used to be a cop, and I mean, she's just a fascinating writer, and these wonderful true crime books. So try Anne Rule. Val McDermott,
Yes,
who is
absolutely.
a Scottish writer, English writer, and has won probably every award there is to win in England and Europe. The book that I would recommend you start with is a book called A Place of Execution.
Yeah.
Phenomenal
Yes,
book.
excellent book.
Beautiful sense of place, character, a story that has twists and turns that you're not going to figure out. Then another new writer to me is, but she's an English writer. I think we overlook English writers because a lot of them aren't published in the U.S. And Anne Cleeves is published now, and her newest book, Raven Black, which is a thriller, won the new Duncan Laurie Dagger for best thriller, and it is